I recently interviewed Roy Blackbeard, the Botswana High Commissioner to the UK. We discussed several hot topics, including the damming of the Okavango River, poaching and sustainable wildlife management, and also the government's relocation of native San people away from their ancestral lands.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule today. So, to kick off, Botswana has an interesting history of pioneering a low-volume, high-end sort of tourism model. Does the government consider this strategy to have been a success for Botswana, and I mean, are there plans to maintain this approach in the future?
Well, yes, certainly we consider it a success, and there's no reason why we would move away. It's paid dividends. But I think possibly for you to understand the dynamics why we took that, or why we adopted a policy of low volume, one has to bear in mind the location and the facilities at our disposal in Botswana. We were blessed with vast areas of different tourist attractions. But the one thing that was, or that is peculiar to all these different areas, is that they all have a very fragile ecosystem. And I'll give you the one example of the Okavango Delta. And it really is a prime destination for tourists, and everybody would love to go to the Delta. But we have to bear in mind that if we were talking about high volume, even if they were high paying volume, it would destruct the ecosystem if you had thousands of tourists. Hence the reason of our policy of having lodges which never would exceed 10, 12 beds. And the whole reason for that is that you have to bear in mind that having a lodge in such a fragile ecosystem, just a small issue of waste disposal, if you had a large volume of people, that would create havoc with the ecosystem. Hence the reason of low volume, high paying, and certainly it's paid dividends, and that is the only way that we see the future. So to answer you very briefly, yes, we believe that the policy will remain in place.
Excellent, okay. And I understand tourism accounts for about 12% of GDP in Botswana, is that right?
That's correct, but let me also take you back a little bit about Botswana. Bear in mind that on independence in 1966, Botswana was one of the poorest countries in Africa. It had a per capita income of $66. It's one of the highest in Africa now. One of the facts that we were blessed with is that we did have minerals. And in the late 70s, 80s, we managed to exploit our diamond industry. It's now one of the largest industries in terms of volume, not the highest, but in terms of value. It is the highest in the world. But that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable is that diamonds, sooner or later, their lifespan comes to an end. And as a government, we wouldn't like to have all our eggs in one basket. And we had to sit down and identify various engines of growth. And certainly tourism is an engine of growth that we see as something that can play an integral part into being able not only to develop it, but as a future source of income.
That's all about diversifying the
That's
economy.
all about diversifying the economy.
Yeah.
Now, if one looks in proportion of the GDP, as you mentioned, 12%, it seems a little, but it's something that's growing. We're not only blessed with the Delta, we're blessed with vast tracts of land. You have the salt pans. It in itself has one of the most fantastic ecosystems, very fragile, but also has a huge abundance of wildlife and even flora. And that in itself is an area that can be developed. We have the desert. There is nothing more beautiful. And when we say desert, people picture something like this table, white sand. That is not what we would call the desert. Yes, we do have that in certain areas. But the vast plains that we have, it's a savanna type situation where you have all your cats, you have huge quantities of your antelope. Yes, when I say huge, numbers have come down considerably, but it's something that if we can develop, there is nothing more serene, more beautiful
and it's
than
secure
to
for the
be in
future.
something like that. And
Yeah.
those are all areas where we see the engine of growth, where we can pass on, where our citizens, the inhabitants of all those areas, can benefit from tourism.
So thinking about protecting those natural assets that the country is so blessed with, as you've said yourself, could you outline some of the work that the government is doing to combat elephant poaching in the country?
Well, possibly once again, let me go back a little bit. Those who are in the know-how and have looked at the statistics and populations of elephants, obviously in other parts of Africa there were elephant populations far greater than ours 10, 20, 30 years ago. Due to poaching, but not only poaching, climate change has also affected the elephant population, drought, those all are factors that one would work into. But as it so happens, Botswana now has the largest population of elephant in the world.
Right.
We've had to protect that species. Now, some of our African brothers and sisters have had a huge problem with poaching of elephant. We recognized it very early in the 80s, in the 90s, that poaching could play a devastating or have a devastating effect on our wildlife population. So we had to put in place a very vigorous anti-poaching unit. Now what you also have to bear in mind that poaching nowadays is not as it used to be. Yes, you will still have the odd animal being snared for somebody who's looking to feed themselves, to maybe sell a bit of ivory, get a bit of pocket money. But poaching has now become a much bigger problem. The trade in endangered species is fast coming to a level or on a par of what you would find from illegal activities of drug sales.
I wonder if I could ask you about that actually. I mean, Botswana was one of 4 African nations earlier in this year to sign the 10-year moratorium on the trade of ivory. I mean, why do African countries have stocks of ivory? Does this not sort of act as a sort of legitimisation of the trade of ivory and therefore the legitimisation of sort of the killing of the elephants? I mean, isn't it better to destroy the stocks like President Moi in Kenya did?
No, I disagree with that.
Right.
I disagree with that because one thing you have to bear in mind, there's always 2 sides of a coin. You will always have elephant that die, so you collect that ivory. You will always have rogue animals that need to be destroyed for the protection of the inhabitants. But the main reason why I disagree with it is that burning your ivory, for me, you would still create a vacuum. I think the only way to look at this is education. You have to get those consumers who use those trophies, tusks, ivory, whatever you want to call it, for either for medicine purposes, that there are other alternatives, and that is where the whole poaching issue is education, education, education.
Well, that's very interesting. And also, I think in 2012 it was announced there'd be a ban on hunting in Botswana. Is this ban producing positive results for wildlife numbers?
We have a fairly vigorous count of our wildlife. And one thing that we had noticed from the onset, that the elephant population in Botswana has a growth rate of 5%, and that has maintained for more than the last decade.
Right, that's good news then.
So when we talk about the ban on hunting, it's not all about elephant, it's about a vast array of species. And the numbers of these species has continually gone down. One cannot only attribute that to hunting. There are various factors. We've had years of drought. We have had hunting. Obviously people hunt for the pot. They hunt to survive. And then we have poaching. We have small-scale poaching and we have large-scale poaching. And we even use our military,
the Botswana Defence Force,
to monitor various species to ensure that poachers that come over fully armed, one can even go to the extent of calling them terrorists, because they come armed with AK-47, they first shoot before they ask questions, and it's a very lucrative trade. So the ban on hunting came about for various reasons, as I've tried to lay out. What the impact will be, one will wait and see. At the end of the day, one would hope that the numbers would increase. And certainly where numbers are not increasing, then one would have to most probably take another stand. The one thing you have to remember why we looked at banning trophy hunting is that if I am a person who desires to come shoot a lion, for example, I'm not going to look for the oldest, flea-bitten, tired lion for a trophy. I'm going to want to pick the biggest male, the one with the biggest name, the one that's in the best condition. And it creates absolute havoc. That whole pride falls to pieces. It's exactly the same as taking a breadwinner in a family who has 4 or 5 children. You take out the breadwinner, where do the rest go? And that is one of the reasons why we stopped hunting.
Interesting. And going back to this ban then, so will it be a blanket ban when it comes in? Are all citizens included in the ban?
The ban is total.
Right.
There will be no hunting. But let me just qualify that. Botswana has various land tenure schemes. We have freehold land, we have what you call tribal land, we have state land. In freehold land, freehold as you would understand freehold, there are farms, there are game farms. They have bred those animals, they're theirs. So in the short term, certainly they will be able to continue to utilize those species. But in state land, game reserves, tribal land, there will be a total ban. There will be no hunting.
Thinking about different land uses in Botswana and the pressures, there's been some controversy, I understand, in the media about the government's handling of the native San people, with the government sort of relocating away from Central Kalahari Game Reserve, their ancestral lands, to new settlements. Could you just confirm what the government's policy is exactly on this issue?
I can certainly confirm the policy, but it's not something that I'm going to be able to do in a nutshell. This is a very, there's a vast difference of opinion. But to put it in a nutshell, the Central Kalahari Game Reserve was home to a few thousand San people. The problem that government had is that all Botswana are equal. We don't look at people from a tribal point of view. We are all equal. We all benefit the same. Any Botswana citizen, including a San, is entitled to be able to reap the benefits of whatever income the country generates. In other words, if there's a diamond mine, that will be distributed throughout the country. We're talking about less than 2% of individuals who are within a game reserve. This area that you're talking about is called the Central Kalahari Game Reserve. The problem is that as we developed from independence, one of my government's priority was to provide education, was to provide health, was to provide water, and all the infrastructure, electricity, telephone, that we would like to provide to all our citizens. The conflict that came about was that individuals in that area wanted all those rights that every citizen was entitled to. But they also wanted to farm. And they introduced, amongst other things, livestock, goats, cows. You're in a game reserve, the lion kills the goat. That means the lion has to be killed because it's going to come kill another goat. That was the first thing. The second thing is that as the population expanded, you have to then make a choice. Your choice being is that, do you want this to remain a game reserve? Because it's not sustainable to have villages, to introduce schools, and it's government's priority, just like in the UK. If you don't send your children to school, you're in trouble.
So really it's an altruistic measure by the government to sort of improve people's living standards rather than clearing an area the size of Denmark, you know, just to be exploited by diamond mining and things like that. It's an altruistic measure.
Firstly, the comparison or the concept that diamond mining is not at the benefit of the few thousand people. The benefits from that mine goes to everyone. Mineral rights in Botswana are owned by the government to share. One of our success stories is that we have good governance. We ensure that all our benefits that we would derive from our minerals goes to the population. Now, coming back to your question that you were talking about, relocating, and it wasn't only San, by the way, and it didn't only happen there, it happened in other areas, where we relocated them to areas that they chose, where they were given the same rain, the same amount of wildlife. However, over time, that wildlife has become depleted.
Right.
So it wasn't relocating them to go and force them to be educated.
Yeah.
But it was the choice of, do we maintain a game reserve, but we also have to allow them to be able to live their culture. And that we haven't taken away from anyone, not only the San. There are more than 8 tribes in Botswana. There are different cultures in various tribes. So contrary to what we have been accused of, is that we forcibly relocated them. It has proved beyond fact that they were compensated. They were relocated to an area similar to where they were, where there was an abundance of wildlife. But the end game is that if they had continued to remain there, then there would be no wildlife.
Namibia, your neighbour just to the north, I understand has mooted plans to perhaps dam the Okavango River before it enters Botswana. Of course, the Okavango River vital for that unique habitat, the delta. What is the government's take on the impact on tourism and the country as a whole that this project would have were it to go ahead?
I think that's a difficult question to answer. Difficult question to answer is that, firstly, Botswana is in the process of having the delta declared a World Heritage Site. You will recall, some years ago, Botswana, a country that is desperate in need of finding new sources of water, purely for drinking, industry, had considered the option of damming the delta. They had sought professional advice to see what the impact would be, not only on tourism, but on the delta, on the ecosystem. As it so happened, there was a huge outcry, and government decided that that was not going to happen, took that decision. Likewise for Namibia, I can't talk or guess what the Namibians would do, but I take it that the Namibians, just like us, need that valuable source of water, would have to think of the consequences, and I take it that our friendly relationship between the two countries, if that time came, one would have to sit down and have an idea what the impact would have, and I take it that all those disadvantages, advantages would then be weighed and a decision taken. So I would never be able to second guess what would happen in the future.
Yeah.
But certainly I think that in itself would be a very delicate issue.
Yeah. What role does the government see tourism playing in the future, in say 15, 20 years' time? Is there a bright future ahead, do you think?
Well, I think it goes back to what we've been talking about in the past 10 minutes. What we all know is that minerals have a lifetime, but one has to look at a sustainable income. One has to look at an engine of growth that can maintain its growth. We are a young country. We are a country the size of France, with a population of 2.5 million people. We have vast areas that can still be utilized for tourism. So to answer your question, where do we see it? We see tourism playing a vital role in the sustainable future of Botswana. Obviously, we will also have to look at other areas.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your time today, Your Excellency.
Pleasure.